Cheetah was so bright, so friendly, so upbeat about everything. She called every one of her interviewees, and these were men who were, older men with high positions in the state. She always called them by their first names until Earl Warren. Never called him by his first name. I always thought Cheetah was just...
You noticed that?
I did notice that, because I never called anyone by his or her first name until some of the women just would introduce themselves as whatever they were, their first names.
Oh, isn't that interesting? Even though you became friends with many of these.
Yes, I did, but initially I never called them.
In letters
and never the men. Never the men. I don't think I ever called. I never called T.J. Kent by his first name. Never. But they always called me by my first name. Always.
It's interesting because that kind of, I think people might say in the world today, this would indicate a power dynamic.
Mm-hmm. It could. I think maybe initially they may have called me Mrs. Chall, but I think always they called me by my first name.
When you started out, were you mainly interviewing older people, older than yourself?
Oh, yes.
Do you remember when that shifted and you were then interviewing your age mates who had the same cultural experiences growing up? And then eventually you were interviewing much younger people. Did that ever enter your...
Oh, some of the women political leaders were my age. Several of them were. I would guess that most of them were about my age. Right. Might have been a little older. All of I think some of the men I interviewed later in these Baumberg Tract interviews and this CVPIA were my age. Not my age, younger than I. And I looked at their dates yesterday to see what the age difference was, and I realized that some of them were younger.
Do you think that affected the way the interview went at all?
No, because they were concerned about this story. If it had to do with the Bradley Miller-Bradley bill, or Seymour, or which all was involved with the election of the first governor or the first President Bush.
I want to go back to the water interviews you did during the Reagan era.
All right.
And I remember Mr. Gianelli, who I think was quite a character. Or was he?
Yes. He was, now I notice that he was about my age. Mm-hmm. But, I never thought about age ever in the interviews. I just noticed it now, that he was born, about a year before I was born. Otherwise, these were gentlemen of note. Right. And I was interviewing them. And you have to remember that I had interviewed people when I was working for the War Labor Board, who came from different parts of the labor and industry spectrum. And I was just 24 years old about that time. So I guess I never gave a thought to age, or the fact that I was a woman interviewing these men. I just never thought about it. Right.
But do you think they thought about it? You didn't get feedback. People, especially in this earlier era, treated women sometimes with kind of a pat on the head.
I never felt that way. I think they respected us. I think by this time Rojo was a respected institution, and this whole government, his documentation, it had some merit, and so I think they were interviewed because they agreed.
And they were often flattered to be chosen to
Yes,
be interviewed.
yes.